In recent decades, the global economy has been shaped by a profound shift in production. Factories that once powered developed economies were relocated to emerging markets in search of lower costs and greater efficiency. In the United States, this process was particularly intense starting in the 1970s, when neoliberal globalization encouraged companies to seek cheap manufacturing in Asia, particularly China. Over time, this industrial dependence became a sensitive issue, and political discourse began to advocate reshoring as a sign of regret, seeking the return of production chains to North American territory. However, despite optimistic rhetoric and policy incentives, the American reindustrialization movement has proven slow, fragmented, and falling short of expectations. The main obstacle is economic. Production costs in the United States remain much higher than in Asian countries, even after decades of technological advancements. The wage gap remains significant, and labor, environmental, and logistical costs weigh heavily on the final calculation. Although automation and robotics promise to reduce the cost of human labor, the initial investment to modernize factories is high and the return uncertain. Assembling a complex product, such as a smartphone, in the United States is still 30% to 40% more expensive than in Chinese and Vietnamese factories. This discrepancy makes reshoring financially unattractive, especially for companies pressured by quarterly results and shareholders demanding consistent profit margins. Supply chains is no simple task. China isn't just a production hub, but an integrated ecosystem that houses suppliers at all levels, logistics service providers, and technological innovation centers. This production density creates economies of agglomeration that are virtually impossible to replicate in the short term. When an American company tries to repatriate its assembly line, it discovers that it relies on hundreds of inputs and components that still need to be imported from Asia. Thus, reshoring is often limited to final assembly, while the production base remains globalized. Another factor limiting the effectiveness of reshoring is the high cost of capital. Rebuilding industrial parks requires billions in investments in infrastructure, energy, technology, and professional training. Although the US government has launched policies such as CHIPS and Science Act, designed to revitalize the production of semiconductors and critical technologies, tax incentives and subsidies are not sufficient to offset the long-term risk. Industrial projects require decades to consolidate, while the financial system operates under short horizons and is averse to uncertainty. In many cases, companies opt for an intermediate solution, transferring part of their production to nearby countries and allies, the so-called nearshoring or friendshoring, such as Mexico, Vietnam, and India. This reduces geopolitical risks without facing the domestic costs of full reshoring. The logic of globalization also remains powerful. Despite trade tensions and the discourse of industrial sovereignty, international trade still offers advantages that no single economy can match. Global supply chains allow for risk diversification, access to raw materials and consumer markets, and greater logistical efficiency. Attempting to completely reverse this integration would be economically irrational for most corporations. Therefore, what we are seeing is a reconfiguration of production routes, not a massive return of manufacturing to domestic territory. There are, of course, exceptions. Sectors considered strategic, such as semiconductors, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and defense, have received substantial investment. The pandemic and US-China tensions have revealed serious vulnerabilities in these areas, which has spurred incentive programs and industrial policies aimed at self-sufficiency. However, even in these sectors, domestic production often depends on imported inputs or international partnerships. The promise of autonomous and competitive manufacturing is still far off. Finally, there's a contradiction between political discourse and business reality. For governments, reshoring represents an electoral and symbolic slogan, bringing jobs back home. For companies, it's a strategic decision based on cost, scale, and efficiency. Thus, many initiatives announced as reshoring are in fact partial. Research centers, prototypes, or final assembly, while mass production remains offshore. The result is a move that's more rhetorical than effective. In short, reshoring doesn't fully work because it confronts the structural forces that shaped globalization: cost, efficiency, interdependence, and financial return. Reversing 40 years of deindustrialization requires more than tax incentives or nationalist rhetoric. It requires rebuilding entire productive ecosystems, supplier networks, infrastructure, and technical capabilities. The world is therefore moving not toward the end of globalization, but toward its reorganization into blocs, a balance between economic efficiency and strategic security. In this new scenario, Made in America can resurface, but on a limited, selective, and above all, symbolic scale.